Arabic grammar revolved around trying to decipher and understand the text of the Quran.
You've described Arabic as more than just a language. You describe it as a battleground. What is the battle being fought and what is at stake?
In Palestine, Arabic is involved in a protracted, violent conflict. So the Arabic language has emerged as a symbol of who we are as Arabs. It is a symbol for many Muslims, and therefore it is not surprising that the notion of conflict is associated with the Arabic language. At the beginning of the Zionist movement in Palestine and the revival of the Hebrew language, there was what's called the language war between the early Zionists who wanted Hebrew to be the language of instruction and German. There were actually riots and battles. One person was killed, but then in the end, Hebrew was chosen. Teaching physics and chemistry in Hebrew was seen as a way of bestowing prestige on a language that is still dead, almost dead.
Welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on this series, we have a giant from the field of Arabic studies. Professor Yasir Suleiman-Malley is the Emeritus Professor of Modern Arabic Studies at the University of Cambridge, and it is a privilege to have him on the series. Professor Yasir, welcome to Afikra.
Thank you very much indeed.
I have a question. Let's just start with a basic sort of biographical question before we get into some of your scholarship. Were you really obsessed with the Arabic language when you were a teenager? Did you have a confrontational relationship with it, a healthy relationship with it? What was your relationship with Arabic growing up?
It was a problematic relationship. It wasn't a comfortable one at school. The reason for it is that we were, I coined a phrase for it, we were harassed grammatically. There was a grammatical harassment at schools in the sense that we had to go into the minutiae of Arabic grammar, which looked like myths from an ancient past. So the grammar that I was taught for its own sake rather than as a means of trying to decipher the structure of the language. I felt it was very unhelpful in terms of allowing me to gain a greater command of the Arabic language. Also, most of the teachers who taught me Arabic were people who did not succeed in presenting the grammar of the language in a user-friendly kind of way, until at some point, in my last 2 years at school in Palestine, we had a teacher who shifted the interest from what may be called the grammar of form to the grammar of meaning. So instead of learning grammar in order to use the right voweling within and at the end of words, the grammar was taught to that it helps you to decipher the meaning of the stretches of language that one is reading or is writing. And that was in a way, the eureka moment for me. That is why in my book, my book, Lugha al-Arabiyya, fi Sahhat al-Lugha, I do mention my teacher who really opened the door for me. And from that moment on, I decided that I was going to work on my Arabic and to try to improve it and to go back to it with love and gusto. Not just as a medium of communication, but also as a subject of study. So in a way, you could say that Yasir Suleiman-Malley is striking back. I'm striking back at the way that I was grammatically harassed when I was a little boy at school in Palestine.
Do you feel like it was the language harassing you or it was the pedagogy?
It was the pedagogy, not the language. Language always had its own rewards through immersion in the beauty of its literature. But it's the way that schools structured the teaching and the learning of language around grammar, and the way that grammar was used as an instrument of coercion, I think, by teachers. So it's nothing to do with the language. It's to do with the way the language was almost turned into a weapon of trying to show us that This is such a great cultural product that no matter how much we try to learn it, we always find ourselves deficient because we can't, as young boys, young students, have control over the grammar of the language or the language itself.
I mean, this checks out. This checks out with my experience as well as almost every single experience of people I've spoken to who grew up in the Arab world. As educators, why have we been so bad at developing a pedagogy that can result in a core of people who are able to have a healthy relationship with language and be able to use it and feel proficient, sufficiently proficient in the language? Is it because there has been is there something unique about how the pedagogy was developed? Like, we are able to teach musicians, we're able to teach mathematicians, we're able to teach physicists and doctors and accountants. We're able to teach all these complicated subjects. We're able to teach Spanish, French, and Mandarin, all these different languages. What is it with Arabic?
Well, this is a very good question, and the answer is complex. First of all, there is the veneration for the language. It is tied ultimately to it being the medium for the Quranic revelation. So put that to one side. Arabic grammar revolved around trying to decipher and understand the text of the Quran. Then a way of handling it, teaching it, was developed over the ages. This way of teaching, the way that was developed for teaching the Arabic language itself gained some veneration. So there's the sacredness of the text of the Quran, the veneration for the language in general, the veneration, cultural veneration for the way that was developed to teach the venerated language of the text, of the sacred text of the Quran. And then there were other sort of reasons, the reasons that are mentioned in the tradition, where teaching Arabic became a profession from which grammarians could eke out a living. So it was not in their interest, to some extent, to make the teaching of Arabic easy. Because if things are easy, then they lose their monetary economic value. So there is another factor. This is actually talked about in the Arabic grammatical tradition itself. There have been attempts to try to simplify Arabic grammar by looking at al-ilal, the causes. We see that by Ibn Mada al-Kirkabi in his book Ar-Radd ala an-Nuhah, Refutation of the Grammarians. But these attempts did not bear fruit. In the modern period, there have been attempts to try to simplify the teaching of the Arabic language, the teaching of grammar, actually. But these attempts had to look back and to try to continue with a tradition that became almost sanctified, and then to respond to modern methodologies for language teaching, which to some extent were imported from fields such as teaching English as a foreign language. And these methods, when applied to the Arabic language, turned the Arabic language almost into a foreign language for its native learners.
Can you give me an example of just, or give me some details on when this process began? Was this in the sort of 20th century, mid-20th century?
In the 19th century,
okay.
Sheikh Rifat Tahtawi tried to develop new methods for teaching Arabic, which he tried to base on methods of teaching French to French speakers.
Where was he?
He was in Egypt. He's a famous sheikh who went to France and wrote a famous book about Paris. And then there have been attempts in the 20th century, but generally, even if you have these attempts at a high macro level, it takes time for them to filter down to people on the ground, teachers in schools. The other problem, of course, is to do with the diglossia. the fact that we have two forms of Arabic, two broadly speaking, two forms of Arabic, the spoken and the written. And teachers of Arabic generally consider one of their primary goals to try to wean the pupils off the spoken language and take them into the written mode of the language, using the grammatical methods that were developed in the past. Instead of seeing the two forms of the language as connected, using the spoken form of the language as a bridge through which to walk into the realm of the written language and its grammar, language teaching in the Arab world somehow consolidates the chasm between them rather than bridging the differences between them. There are so many similarities between them. So I would say that history is an important part in answering the question. The place of the Arabic language in Arab culture, by virtue of its connection to a sacred text, the text of the Quran, the veneration of the language, the sanctified form of teaching grammar, but also the resistance to modes of reforming the teaching of the language, because the impetus behind them generally tend to be ones that are seen to come from the outside, and therefore they are seen as an attack on Arabic, by virtue of it being a symbol of Arab identity and the Arab's place in history.
Okay. I want to get to this to this idea of conflict, because it's funny, if somebody looks at the titles of some of the books you've written, it sounds like you're describing war. I mean, even just the idea of harassment and conflict and battlegrounds. So you've described Arabic as more than just a language. You describe it as a battleground. What is the battle being fought, and what is at stake?
I think what is at stake ultimately is how the elite, but also people who share the Arabic language, I'm not saying speak it or use it, but who share it as a cultural symbol.
Like 1 billion people globally.
Right. Use it in order to talk about their identity. Arabic emerges throughout its history. For example, during the Shawbiya period, in the Abbasids era, and in the 20th century, 19th century, as a symbol of Arabness. So it is a symbol of who we are. And when symbols of identity are pressed into service, they become arenas through which conflict can be expressed. I don't like the term language wars. There are no wars, but there is conflict. And conflict can be defined not just in terms of open military conflict, but you have stress, you have differences, you have very vocal differences. So the Arabic language has emerged as a symbol of who we are as Arabs. It is a symbol for many Muslims, and therefore it is not surprising that the notion of conflict at different levels of intensity is associated with the Arabic language. Some cases, like for example, in Palestine, Arabic is involved in a protracted, violent conflict. And that is a very clear case of conflict at a very heightened level. At the same time, it should be really important to stress Arabic is not alone in this respect. All languages, English itself, French, German in the past, even now, Russian, all languages find themselves in situations where they have to fight, where they have to, where they are deployed as ways of trying to define a group's identity, and at the same time warding off attacks from the outside, or what is seen as attacks from the outside. French is a very good example.
Yeah.
French in the modern period is a very good example, but also French in the period of its formation in the past 2 centuries had to fight internal battles within France in order to gain the prominence and the recognition as the official language. The same is true of German. Think of Trump, who just 3 weeks ago signed an executive order declaring that English is the official language of the United States, although English in the United States is under heightened definitions of conflict, is not under conflict at all. So languages are used as proxies, as indirect ways to talk not about language, but about extra-linguistic matters in society, affairs in society.
Over the course of your career, if you were to track, I'm going to use a really opaque term that's hard to define, but I'm doing it intentionally. If you were to track the health of the Arabic language globally over the last, few decades of your career, are we at a crisis point? Are we at a catastrophe levels, or has Arabic never been more healthy?
Well, this is a big question. I am not going to be offering a definitive answer.
Yeah.
But let me just say this. Concerns about Arabic have never ceased to exist. They were expressed in the past, even in the glorious past, and they have been expressed over the last 1,000 years. In my book, اللغة العربية في ساحات الوعي and elsewhere, I refer to the introduction of Ibn Mandur في لسان العرب, in لسان العرب. Ibn Mandur describes the situation of Arabic in his own time as almost on the point of extinction. And he says, because of this, I am going to compose this lexicon, which will become like Noah's tent to, as it were, save humanity from extinction. So fears about language, any language, always exist. Now, when nations, groups are strong, they seem to be able to withstand these anxieties about their own language. However, when they feel that they are fractured, that they are weak, that they are not occupying what they regard as their rightful place in history, somehow their languages become or thought to feel more vulnerable. Maybe there is a greater vulnerability of feeling around Arabic now, but that doesn't, in my view, translate into a weakness of the language. People talk about the corrosive effects of the social media, the internet on Arabic in the same way as they talk about it in English and other languages. So Arabic is not outside the human realm in that respect. However, our anxieties, our feelings maybe are amplified because of the position of political weakness that the Arabs are living through in modern times.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like in my travels, the places with the largest concerns about the health of the Arabic language, from my perspective, from my limited perspective, it's usually a lot of that is coming from the Gulf. And where there's like a real beating drum of we need to emphasize secure the health and the future of the Arabic language and proliferate how many people are speaking and the amount of content and the amount of stuff in Arabic, which those countries and those economies are much more secure than places like Egypt or Lebanon or Iraq or Tunisia or Syria. And those places, I don't get a lot of that drumbeat.
Well, I think it would be really important to, first of all, enter a comment on what you've said.
Yeah, please.
I'm not talking about a Dawla al-Qutbiyya, the people call it nation state. I don't call it nation state. I call it state nations. Because they're not nation states. They're not states constituted around nations. They are states that are in the process of creating nations. So it is state nationalism rather than nation statism. So let me just say this. I'm talking about Arabic as a cultural symbol that belongs to all those who consider themselves to be Arabs and therefore connected to its history, to its past glories, to what it stands for in many domains. And these anxieties belong to a pan community of speakers. If you want to call the Pan-Arab nation, that's fine by me. Now, in the Gulf, I think the reason why there is this concern, it's because of the commanding presence of international languages, mainly English, in the field of commerce, and the fact that when you have people from all over the world, you always look for a lingua franca. And English, by default, is the lingua franca. It couldn't, and the Arabic language could not fulfill that role in those countries. Maybe in the past, it would have, it was a lingua franca. Now, people who come from the West, from Asia, from other places, the common denominator among them is some command of the English language as the lingua franca. And if you live in a globalized world, you are connected to commerce and to economic activity and to finance all over the place, then you need a lingua franca. So English has a commanding presence, which leads to real and keenly felt invisibility for the Arabic language. And that is why in those countries you see that this drumbeat, as you've said it, to support Arabic. Again, you could read it in this way. Why are those countries trying to champion Arabic? On the one level, because they're trying to deal with the linguistic situation, the linguistic market where they are, in the way that I've described it. But there's another very important reason. Those countries are trying to lead. Actually, most of the modernization, not modernity, most of the modernization that's coming through into Lebanon, into other parts of the world, now comes from the Gulf. The Gulf is the entry point for modernization in at least as much, I don't know about Amman. Now, those countries have been leading the way in championing cultural symptoms and turning them into symbols of their nation states or state nations. So don't you think that by becoming the champion and declaring that you're the champion and working to become the champion of the Arabic language, that gives you a lot of cultural kudos, a lot of cultural capital, and also makes you more immunized from attacks on you as somebody who's, or as a group of people who are lax in their commitment to one of the most important cultural symbols in Arab history. That is how I read it. Maybe this is not the best reading, but I think it's a reading that has some validity to it.
Interesting. I want to ask you about this idea of decolonization. And a lot of times people say, like within my circles, people say we need to decolonize our rhetoric and decolonize our spaces, which means that we need to speak Arabic more. We need to stop using colonial languages like French and English and start using Arabic. Do you think that makes sense?
Yes and no. No, because we need to have access to languages in order to live our lives, not just English and French. We need to have access to regional languages. We need more people to know Turkish. We need more people to know Persian. We need more people to know Hebrew. We need more people to know other languages, I think, internationally. Second point is, and we need to champion our language. We need to champion Arabic. The reason for it is that Arabic symbolizes the respect we have for ourselves, the respect that we demand of other people to have of us, and that is very important. At the same time, I think, except for the very elite, the very highly educated ones, in fact, the command of European languages, and even English, amongst the vast swathe of Arabic-speaking people is not that great. People who are good at mimicry, people who yes, can engage you in a conversation in English. But if you actually ask them to engage in a real intellectual conversation, you'll find that they start to struggle. If you really ask them to write a good, coherent piece of English, to argue a point, or even to present themselves, you'll find that they'll start to mimic received formulae rather than to be creative. I have very many experiences of this.
Do you think they can be creative in Fusha?
I think if they were to attend to it in the same way that they attend to English, I think they would be. At least I can say this with a great deal of confidence. You'll find that their sociolinguistic knowledge of the Arabic language, i.e. the context in which Arabic lives, would be far greater than the awareness of these people of the sociolinguistic context of English, for example, among those who pretend to have near command and the very high level of the English language. So if people apply themselves, they of course will be able to do so. Let me give you one example. Sati al-Husri, the father of Arab nationalism, when he was born to a family that spoke Turkish. He lived in the Ottoman Empire. He championed the continuation of the Ottoman Empire. When it fell, of course, he revised his ideas about nationalism in general and started to espouse an Arabic-based national identity. Sati al-Husri spoke Arabic with a very clear, pronounced Turkish accent all his life.
Yeah.
And he used to be very proud of it. And he used to say, it is actually better for me to speak Arabic with a Turkish accent than to speak Turkish fluently, because I am well within myself who I am by speaking Arabic with a Turkish accent. So what we really need to do in dealing with our young people is to stop penalizing them and criticizing them for every mistake they make. In my approach to Fusha, I say, if you use Fusha and commit an error, then you will receive 1 hasana. Now, if you don't commit an error, you will receive 2 hasanati. On the basis that those who exercise jihad and get the points right, they will receive 2 rewards, and those who don't will receive 1 reward. And let me just also...
I think it should be the opposite.
Is it the opposite?
I think it should be the opposite. I think it should be that if you make a mistake, you should get 2 points, and if you say it right, that means maybe you're not pushing yourself into points of uncomfort.
We would be encouraging people to be more adventurous. Let me, Mikey, just give you 2 examples.
Yeah.
I think we'll start to put the responsibility in front of each one of us, and also responsibility amongst those who are decision makers at all levels. I'm not talking about state presidents. Now, when the Zionist movement came to Palestine, Hebrew, for all intents and purposes, as a language, was almost dead. And Hebrew was revived, and now it's taught. It is used to teach nuclear physics and medicine and everything. Let me also try to accentuate this a little bit by saying that when we talk about mother tongues, what does a mother tongue mean? It is the language that you learn from your mother. At the beginning of the Zionist movement in Palestine and the revival of the Hebrew language, mother tongue meant that mothers learned the Hebrew language from their children. That is what mother tongue meant, right? Now, if a language that was deemed to be dead was revived and now enjoys a very vibrant social, political, cultural life.
Within 1 generation.
Within 100 years, in a few generations.
But they were probably teaching physics. Sorry to cut you off. They were probably teaching physics within 30, 40 years.
No, they were teaching physics even before the British Mandate. Because you're right, absolutely. In 1913, the Technion in Haifa was established, and there was what's called the language war between the early Zionists, very radical nationalists, who wanted Hebrew to be the language of instruction. And because the Technion was established by a German Jewish organization, they wanted German, because they were in competition with the French, to be used there. In the end, there were actually riots and battles. One person was killed, but then in the end, Hebrew was chosen, even before Hebrew was revived. So actually teaching physics and chemistry and advanced science in Hebrew was seen as a way of bestowing prestige on a language that is still dead, almost dead, right? There are lessons for us to learn. The other one, which is important.
Can I stop you here before we move on to the second lesson? Because that's an interesting reading. And the same could be said about Ataturk and sort of modern Turkish, a similar thing. But I wonder if, again, to policymakers at all levels, presidents down to developers of high school curricula and elementary school curricula, I wonder if we should be taking a page out of the book of the Zionists, or if we should say this is inorganic and this creates violent structures and unnatural connections to language, and instead let's have an organic relationship, and if a language can live on its own strength, then it should live, and if it doesn't live on its own strength, we should embrace the languages that do live on their own merits.
Well, you could take that. I mean, but even if you were to do it, to take that attitude, right, because long canon sneeze.
Exactly.
Right. But also just to take you back to, just to amplify the point about Hebrew, I think part of the success, let's then just say that mother tongue in early Zionist movement in Palestine, mother tongue meant a language that the mother learns from the child rather than vice versa. Well, secondly, the revival succeeded, and there's a lesson for us in Palestine, because there were very few older speakers who could then say to the child who learned Hebrew and spending time learning Hebrew, oh, this is not the way you say it. This is wrong. Right? We have a comparable experience, the attempt to revitalize Breton in France, northern France, and which is a language which was down on its knees. Now, that experiment did not succeed in the same way, although it was concomitant temporarily with the revival of Hebrew, because there are still older Breton speakers who would then listen to these youngsters speaking this sort of Breton and telling them, oh, no, this is rubbish, this is not right. And that is what happens to us in Arabic. You go to a meeting and you say, okay, I'm going to speak with using Fasiha. No, I don't talk about Fasiha, even alone, And you're always saying, oh my goodness me, there are 100 people here. They're all waiting for me to make the first error, and they start to criticize me for that error. I.e., instead of saying, thank you for attempting to use the Fasiha, they say, oh, but you put the subject in the accusative and the object in the nominative. So that is another lesson. And let me just give you a final lesson from the Zionist experience. The greatest Hebrew poet in the modern period is Chaim Bialik. Now, he was Russian, came to Palestine, and composed his poetry in Hebrew. The Zionists had a very strict view of the importance of using Hebrew all the time. Bialik, his mother tongue wasn't Hebrew. His mother tongue was Yiddish, and he spoke Russian. So he came to Palestine and he tried to apply the Zionist dictum of using Hebrew all the time. However, on Saturday, it is reported on the Sabbath, the Jewish Sabbath, Bialik was reported to going back to Yiddish and using Yiddish on the Sabbath, not Hebrew, which is the sacred language for the for the Sabbath, the equivalent of our Yom Zumah or Yom Al-Ahad. And then he used to justify it by saying, well, look, learning Hebrew is work, hard work. And we, Jews, have been commanded not to work on the Sabbath. So I'm going to use Yiddish because learning Hebrew for me is work. Look at the degree of dedication, right? So, and that is, I think, these are the kinds of things that we need to learn from in terms of our attitude to and position towards Arabic. You talked about language policy. Nowadays, people use a different concept, which is called language management. Because language management takes the linguistic enterprise away from completely being in the hands of the institutional organizations of the state, down to the school and to the classroom, and say the family is also an institution, and the family has to have, as it were, a language policy for itself, and it needs to manage that language policy. So I think the idea that, oh, it is the state, it is the responsibility of the government, of officials. The question is, what is your responsibility as a family? What is your responsibility as an individual? I'm not calling for Arabic and nothing else. We need to have a basket. We need to have a battery of linguistic competence. And we need to be able to use them. But that should never be at the expense of our language as the medium for our creativity in all fields, but also a symbol of our identity, of our connection to the past, and of who we are in the modern world.
It's interesting because I feel like when people talk about identity, let's say Arab identity, it's always described as a very something to be celebrated, right? Which I'm not going to try to interrogate that point. However, I do want to explore it because languages, and Hebrew is a really good example of this, languages are used when tied to identity, can be used to create in-groups and out-groups. This is a membership card, right? This is used as a membership card. You want to be part of this group? You learn the language. Trump is doing it right now. You want to be part of this group? You learn the language. Whereas within the context of Arab identity, right now, within the 22 countries that are in the Arab League, there are tens of millions, if not 100 million people who do not speak Arabic because they are from South Asia and they're from Africa and they're from Europe and they're from all over the place and they're building their future here, and a huge part of their past has been here, or they're from Central Asia. Those people are not being issued that identity card, that membership card, nor are the hundreds of millions of people whose ancestors are from the Arabic-speaking world who live all over the world. And so I wonder if this idea of using Arabic as a barometer or a litmus test for that membership card is really the right way to go. Instead of saying, how can we make this a lingua franca? How can we make this language only created as a way to deal and trade in the world?
I mean, this is again a very important point. Look, we can't live our lives without the principle of alterity. You are who you are because you're different from somebody else with respect to some particular point.
Sure.
Right? It could be because you belong to a certain club. It could be because of your lifestyle. So the idea that we can live our life in a liquid kind of way, without borders, is just bonkers, right?
Yeah.
So we have to accept this. Languages indeed are ways of defining who we are as in-groups and out-groups, as also a matrix group in which there are subgroups. So we could all belong to an Arabic language, a notion of the Arabic language, those who want to profess that kind of identity. But within that, there are nested identities based around regional dialects, state, nations, kind of dialects. They could be confessional, they could be social. So we've got to accept a notion of diversity. So we should not throw the baby with the bathwater. Diversity is important, but also a link that brings people together, that is based around a notion of the Arabic language, is that baby we should not throw it out.
Let me ask you a question, a historical question. I want to sort of back up a little further to understand this within the long view. So yesterday I interviewed somebody about Ghazali, and I was as you're talking now, I think I'm wondering to myself, do you think Ghazali or Ibn Rushd or Ibn Sina would have said that, you know, we really need to protect Arabic and we are Arabs? I mean, by today's modern definition, they probably wouldn't have been categorized as Arabs. Was that a part of the conversation, you know, 1,000 years ago in Baghdad?
I don't know, but I don't think that in those days the conversation would have been pressing in any sense. Those people were living in a culture that was an ascendant. It was the international culture. And they would have certainly said, yeah, we are Arabs culturally, because they would have gained from the kudos of the culture. They wrote in Arabic, they taught in Arabic, they were understood by others and copied or translated out of Arabic. My goodness, they lived their private lives in maybe in Persian or some other language. But anything that they've done that has allowed them to continue to be relevant and present in our modern world is related to a notion of language that is in the service of a culture to which people from different ethnicities belonged. Khwarizmi did not write in Persian or Turkish or Tajikistan. He wrote in Arabic. So if we say that Khwarizmi was an Arab, we should be careful not to then pan-nationalize as though he is more living at the same time as Jabal Abdul Nasser in the 50s and 60s, right?
Yeah.
That he did. So I think we should make sure that we do not read back into history some of the ideological notions that have developed in the modern period. Yes, in their days, there were people of Arab culture. They belonged to that culture. They wrote in Arabic. They felt at home in Arabic. And in a sense, maybe they felt if they were asked, they might have said, oh yes, I'm an Arab. Same with Ibn Maymun. I mean, Ibn Maymun wrote quite a lot in Arabic.
Yeah.
He wrote quite a large amount of it using Hebrew characters, right? And people, Israeli scholars continue talking about Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Arabic. It is Arabic written in Hebrew characters, in the same way as some Spaniards wrote Spanish using Arabic characters. Right. I say to my Semitic scholar friends and to Israelis, I say, Judeo-Arabic, would it be easier for me to read Ibn Maymun in his writings in Arabic using Hebrew characters than it is for you who know the Hebrew characters to read it? And they'll say, well, of course it's easier for you. What you have to do is just to learn the Hebrew characters, and then you can read it because it's Arabic, right? So to me, Ibn Maymun, if he wishes to, and he would have said, yeah, I am part of that culture. And he actually intersected with people working through the medium of Arabic. So I don't really think that I would feel comfortable with the way of dissecting the past on the basis of the present.
So
that's what we do.
I totally agree with you. So if you fast forward to the 19th and 20th century, when did the idea, I mean, you write about this in your book, The Arabic Language and National Identity. When did the idea of Arabic being sort of instrumental in forming this identity begin? And was it just directly in opposition to the Ottoman Empire and sort of Turkish identity?
I think that is what united it. It is in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century. Now, in the 1860s, the Tanzimat came through an attempt, a very nascent attempt at Turkification started to emerge. And this somehow ignited an interest amongst the Arab speakers, amongst the elite, to define themselves also linguistically. So Turkification led to the Arabs Arabizing themselves ideologically. And I think they had every reason to do so, because the Ottomans looked down upon the Turkish language. The word rouge, which was used during the invasion of Iraq by the Americans, if you remember al-Rouge now, that term was used to refer Uruj al-Turk, right? So the Turks themselves, the Ottomans, used to look down upon Turkish as a language that is uncouth, a language to a rural people that haven't attained the highest points of culture, that they've lived through their experience historically with Arab culture. Now, Turkification movement started linguistically by starting to write grammars for the Turkish language at a time when grammars for that language did not exist. So I think the Arab elite, and the Bladashah in particular, started to see themselves being sidelined and considered as not properly Ottoman, because the language is Arabic. Of course, they championed Arabic, and they turned it into a symbol that defined who they are.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about Diglossia. We've talked about it before, but for those people listening, can you just define it really simply? What is Diglossia, and why might it be a positive aspect of the language, and why might it be a challenge?
Now, Diglossia and other scholars, they talked about it as Diwajiyya Nawawi. They talked about there are two forms of the language, Mahkiya and Maktuba, right? So they've always existed. And even in the past, with the times of the Shah, they were aware that there were two forms of Arabic, the spoken and the written. So, generally speaking, Diglossia is about two forms of the language, the Mahkiya and the Amiyat, if you want, and the standard literary Fusha Fasiha end. And there are also other things in between, other forms of accommodation that lead us to level up or level down or level sideways. So this is Diglossia. It is a form of different levels, registers, whatever you want, forms of the same language. Some people define them as different languages, and I say they are not, because the definition of a language is not something based on structure. It's not something based on a linguistic analysis. A language, as some people defined it, is a dialect that has an army and a navy, or a navy and a flag, right?
Yeah.
So the Arabs consider these two forms of the language as part of one language. And for me, that is how I look at Diglossia, regardless of how Western scholars define it. Because I look at it as an internal definition rather than something which is brought to us from the outside. Is it a problem in itself? Well, it can become a problem if you turn it into a problem. Problems don't present themselves as problems out of nothing.
Mm-hmm.
They will hold. Something becomes a problem because it is conceptualized as a problem. So what we really need to do in handling this rich array of Arabics that we have is to develop conceptual framework and a practical one in terms of teaching and learning, whereby these forms assist each other rather than splinter each other. Nowadays, for example, in teaching Arabic in some Western universities, and they tend to be taught by Arabs who have raised the status of the Mahkiyat to an extent that they have become the dominant form of language teaching and learning. And I always joke, and I've written about this, just imagine, Mikey, with me, that somebody graduates from the University of Cambridge, the mighty, great University of Cambridge, at which I've worked and I'm still organically attached to, gets a degree in Arabic, focusing mostly on the Makkiyya, the Arabiyya of Egypt, for example. I think if we say, well, this is a valid way of teaching Arabic to non-Arabs, then the logical consequence of this is the following. When these guys are issued with a degree certificate should say, the University of Cambridge, the great and mighty University of Cambridge, hereby certify that John Anderson graduated with a degree in Arabic, a BSc in Arabic, or a BA in Arabic. And we do certify that he is illiterate. Do you see the logical contradiction?
Yeah, of course.
So what we are doing, and this is, you talked about decolonization. Decolonization ultimately is about dismantling or critiquing or dismantling structures of power. Now, when you have young generations of Arabs studying in the West who are fed this idea that the Arabiyya and the Fusha, based on linguistics, are two different languages. They are different languages, right? Which linguistically, on the basis of linguistics, could be argued to be the case. But for the Arabs themselves, are regarded as two different forms of the language, one language. You start to conceptualize the Arabic language situation in that way on the basis of studies of it in linguistics as it emanates from the West, right? Then we will have a big problem. And that is one of the things I have actually to struggle with. And let me just make my point about being illiterate. When the missionaries came to the Arab world, I'm also engaged in writing a book on the language translation and conflict, and focusing on the Quran in particular and the Bible, translation of the Bible. When in the 19th century, the missionaries came to Egypt and to Lebanon and elsewhere, particularly to Egypt, and they wanted to convert people, Muslims, to Christianity for lots of reasons. Some of them are Orientalist reasons, colonialist reasons, to do it ultimately with power. And now they had a big bust up amongst themselves, and they came up with a shi'ar, with a slogan, which was interpreted in two different ways. So, in translating the Bible into Arabic, do we translate it into the Mahkiyat, or do we translate it into a form of a Fasiha? And the slogan was, in dealing with proselytizing the Arabs through translations of the Bible, even Muslims through translations of the Bible, do what the Arabs do. Right? What does this slogan mean? For some it meant, well, the Arabs speak in Makkiyat, so we will have to translate into Makkiyat. The others said, when the Arabs write, they don't write in Makkiyat, they write in a literary form of the language, and literacy is defined in that way. Therefore, we must translate the Bible into a literate form of Arabic. What they also faced, and this is really important for us, what they faced as a problem, a big problem, is that when they translated the Bible into Makkiyat, and they tried to give it to Christians in the Arab world to read through it and to study it and to worship in it, they refused. The Copts totally refused. And the reason for it is that they thought that the Makkiyat, while not a form of the language that is suitable to address God and to be in the presence of God. Why? Because the Quran has defined for all Arabic speakers that when you are in the presence of the divine, you need to use a form of the language that is literate, right? And that is part of the complexity of our language situation. So I don't believe that there is a problem between the Fusha and the Arabiyya unless we seek to conceptualize the relationship as problematic and then proceed on to define a problem and then try to offer spurious solutions for it. As I said to you, people in Harvard, maybe, and other universities who are learning the Mahkiyya and hardly can read a poem or even a short story. Yes, they have a BA in Arab illiteracy.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But, it's funny. I mean, this idea of mahkiyat and like written and spoken Arabic, to me, is interesting because why would no one write the spoken? I mean, why didn't that take off? I don't understand why that didn't take off. It would be the equivalent of somebody saying there's written music and there's played music.
Well, is that the right analogy?
I think so. I mean, the idea of basically saying if you want to write music, you write it down and it's a different melody and a different harmony and it's similar, some similarities. But when you actually get into the jazz bar to play it, you play it totally different and you never write that down.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you why I think I am not musically literate, and why I've asked about the appropriateness of the analogy.
Yeah.
I think what I would say is this: is that people tried in the 1910s and 1920s in Egypt, for example, قضية تمصير اللغة, which ultimately said champion, not in the way of, but then after that, people wanted to write in the Amir. Even Louis Awa, when he wrote his مذكرات طالب بعثة, and he vowed never to write in Fusha again, but he then had to write in Fusha. I think the reason for it is that at the initial point of doing it, the audience that receives it will always think it is not serious, it's not funny, it is almost funny, one. Secondly, people are aware of how dangerous this is. It's dangerous at different levels. At one level, you're creating national state-nation vernaculars. So, أنا بحكي عراقي, and then it is dangerous because then this is the beginning of losing that connection with this past that we are so very proud of, and everybody wants to somehow adopt and to use that to himself or herself. In a world where there are so many anxieties, because nationalism and identity comes to the fore when there are anxieties that individuals live through.
Yeah, it's a security blanket.
Absolutely. The other reason, tell you, because I think about this as the chair of the International Prize for Arabic Fiction. So, as you know, the novel is now the Diwan al-Arab, to a great extent. Now, let's imagine what would happen if the Moroccans were to write in a Moroccan form of Arabic, the Algerians in different, and the Tunisians, the Libyans, the Egyptians, and then we come to the Mashraq. Then we are going to end up with a cultural market that is so fractured and so divided that actually economically it's not going to be even viable to sustain. Maybe you could say, oh, we'll increase the participating publics because the language will be, but then after that, these languages will start to, these vernaculars will start to be codified, and then they will ossify, and then they will turn into a form of Arabic that people wanted to get rid of.
It's interesting. I want to push back on this for a second, because if we look at pop culture in the Arab world, which, with all due respect to novels, pop music probably connects more people, and like reality television connects more people. Lal-asaf, in the Arab world, or every single region, popular culture is what really creates a shared experience. And every single culture everywhere in the world, popular culture and technology and all these different things really end up connecting us. And pop music, for example, in the region really connects us. And so I was in Tunisia not too long ago, and they're singing word for word Palestinian songs and Lebanese songs, and you're in Saudi and they know Iraqi songs, and you're in Iraq and they know Tunisian songs, and they say them in their dialect. They are quoting them word for word in the dialect, and it unites them. The same way you watch a reality TV show or musalsalat. The musalsalat are in the dialects of the place. They're not in Fusha. Definitely not.
No, I'm not saying that. Remember, as long as things right. What is the function of writing?
Yeah.
When you're writing has a function, and it does do things that the spoken word doesn't do. Once you start to commit things to writing, then you start to standardize straight away.
Yeah.
And you start to create visible marks that are displaced and that travel, forward into history and back into history. What I would say is that maybe people, without knowing it, do realize that using I know that publishers say, "Well, my goodness, in the short to medium term, I am going to lose my market for books. Now you publish in Morocco and you can be sold in Oman. You win the prize in Oman and you travel the Arab world, and you speak when you're traveling. You speak with a form of Fusha, with mistakes like me, like mine, and but Arabic Arabic is a lingua franca for the Arabs, right? And I think there's a lot to be lost politically, culturally, economically, socially, if we were to divide up along forms of language that are state-based. Because they will have to be state-based. Because you're not, for example, I'm sure that the Qataris would want to have a Qatari, so اللغة القطرية, اللغة البحرينية, and then you'll start to say, are these different, languages? Yes, they can become different languages if we choose to decide to make them different languages. In the same way as the Scandinavian languages, Denmark, Danish, and Norwegian, are really, in comparison with the Arabic language situation, they're more like dialects of a Nordic language rather than different languages. And again, look at what happened in former Yugoslavia. There was a Serbo-Croat, which after the civil war divided up into Bosnian, into Croatian, into Serbian, God knows what, and they're all actually the same language. So the question becomes, in spite of the fact that Arabness doesn't seem to be a political force, do we really want to even to fracture and crush ourselves beyond the state of fracture and division that we are experiencing at the moment? I wonder.
I mean, if you look at the time of Ibn Sina and all these people, they didn't try to define these things, right? So they allowed people to speak however they want to speak, and if they want to write, however they want to write, and it was all considered Arabic.
Well, yes, people. That's true, but those questions were not really pressing on the communities of that time in the same way that they are pressing on us at the moment. We're living in a world which is significantly and markedly, almost categorically different from, not categorically, but it's very different from the world of those people. There was a time, I remember, my father was born was born during the Ottoman Empire, and he used to travel without a passport from Jerusalem to Constantinople. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, he had to carry a passport. He couldn't travel from Jerusalem or Tiberias, where he used to live, to Damascus without a passport. It is a different world. So we live in a vastly different world that conceptualizes itself, sees itself, divides itself differently. And I do personally think that we gain a lot from being together than standing alone as different entities.
Professor Yasir, thank you so much for for joining us. I really, really appreciate it. If you're listening, please go pick up some of his books. There's many of them. You can look on academia.edu or Google Scholar for tons of them. It was a real pleasure having you on. I appreciate it.
Thank you.